But the reason we're here this evening is because you're also the author of one of Reformation Trust's new books, Saving the Reformation, the pastoral theology of the canons of Dort. So we're going to sit here for the next 20 minutes or so and discuss this book. Are you game for that?
I am, because this book is probably going to set Ligonier up financially for decades to come.
Working in communications, being the director of communications, I knew, having a title on Dort, that we wouldn't be able to, keep the inventory. So
that's right. When Chris Larson approved the publication of this book, I said to him, "It's lovely of you to publish this, but do you actually think you'll sell any?" And he said, "Oh, I think we'll sell tens of tens." What? So I think that's 40. So hopefully we might make that.
Well, I bought one so I could read it. So.
You read it?
I did read it.
Oh, good. All
right.
right.
I know that you always like to ask that question, so I did read the book.
Did you read it slowly and thoughtfully, or did you kind of power through? That's all right.
Let's continue the interview. So the title of the book is Saving the Reformation. It's kind of a rather maybe audacious or dramatic title, Saving the Reformation. Cheeky title.
Cheeky title.
We would say that in Australia.
Yes.
So tell us, if the Synod of Dort saved the Reformation, firstly, how did it save the Reformation? And why do so many people, maybe even some here, maybe they've never even heard of the Synod of Dort, if it actually did save the Reformation?
Haven't heard of the Synod of Dort?
It's possible. There are people out there.
Yes, we live in desperate times. Those are really good questions. Let me see if I can answer them with a good answer. I think one of the things that can be said about the Reformation, and often is said about the Reformation, is that it was the recovery of sola gratia, by grace alone, that we are not saved by grace plus something else. We're not saved by Christ plus something else. We're saved by Christ alone, by grace alone. And what really happened in the Netherlands was that the Dutch Reformed Church, that was formed in heroic struggle against the Roman Catholic government that persecuted and martyred thousands of Reformed people, the Reformed Church grew, it prospered, and it established itself as the official church in the Netherlands. And then along comes a minister by the name of Arminius, who begins to challenge the received Reformed theology, and really is, although he tried to do it very cautiously, he really was reintroducing a semi-Pelagian theology, which is to say, compromising the doctrine of grace alone. And therefore, to the extent the Reformation was about grace alone, the rejection of Arminianism saved the Reformation. And so it's a slightly cheeky title, but it's good for marketing. But I also think it's somewhat accurate. And I think that's important because, as you may well know, what we call the 5 points of Calvinism arose from the doctrinal decisions at the Synod of Dort. And there has been a tendency in some circles to see the 5 points of Calvinism as just kind of the frosting on the Reformed cake, not to see it as really essential or foundational. And I think what I'm trying to argue in this book is that the 5 points of Calvinism may at first glance seem rather narrowly focused, but in fact, they're all tied into this topic of grace alone, Christ alone, and therefore they're not an icing on the cake. They're essential to preserving the very character of Reformed theology.
We brought up the 5 points of Calvinism, and over the last decade plus, there's been a great resurgence in new Calvinism, renewed interest in the 5 points of Calvinism. How is it that we've got to this point where people can know the 5 solas of the Reformation, the 5 points of Calvinism, but as we kind of hinted at earlier, a lot of people don't realize the origin of those 5 points. They don't know they came from the Synod of Dort and their response to the remonstrance. How have we come to this place where our knowledge of church history is so lacking?
This probably reflects that not enough people have bought the Ligonier series on church history, available. Is that bad?
At ligonier.org, yeah.
Available at ligonier.org. You know, the state of the American church is a pretty ahistorical state. I mean, Americans, you know, have always followed that great philosopher, Henry Ford, who said history is bunk. Americans by nature have been forward-looking, not backward-looking. So history has never been our strong suit as Americans, and then that very much affects the character and state and interests of the church as well. The crucial thing, of course, is not really to know about the Synod of Dort just as a tidbit of history, but the value of knowing about the Synod of Dort is it really was the greatest Reformed ecclesiastical gathering anywhere. What's the word I want? At any time, in any place. And so it really is an event worth remembering. These folks went to this relatively small Dutch town that had the name Dordrecht, that we abbreviate in English as Dort, and they met there for 6.5 months and worked to produce a clear statement of Calvinist theology. And we call it the 5 points of Calvinism. I don't think they would have called it that because Calvinism doesn't have 5 points. This is an argument I make in the book, as you well remember.
I'm so glad I did read the book.
Yes. Arminianism has 5 points. It was Arminianism that reduced the discussion and the debate to 5 points. And the Synod of Dort responds to the 5 points of Arminianism, or more accurately, the 5 errors of Arminianism. So really what the Synod of Dort would say it did was to provide biblical answers to the 5 errors of Arminianism. So we should be careful about that, because Calvinism is not summarized in 5 points, which could be implied when we talk about the 5 points of Calvinism. If you want a summary of Calvinism, you should read the Westminster Confession or the Heidelberg Catechism or the Belgic Confession. These are the summaries of Calvinism as a whole, and what Dort did was to respond to particular errors that were challenging Calvinism.
Now, there's also a lot that we can learn about false teaching and how it infiltrates the church. The Remonstrants, and as they're preparing these 5 points, you note that they were very careful in the way they phrased them, trying to make them sound biblical, sound more believing. So what can we learn today as we think about the threat of false teaching?
Well, to quote Chris Larson, what we could learn is that we need to know theology, theology, theology. That is to say, we have to be able to develop not only a knowledge of what we believe, but it's very helpful to learn something about how wrong points of view can be articulated and formulated to, at first glance, sound biblical. And so the Arminians, for example, would make their point, and then they'd quote a Bible verse. And it's very tempting to see, if people seem to be quoting a Bible verse, to think it must be okay. But in fact, it was a subtle but clear denial of biblical teaching.
So I think the question that a lot of the folks here probably want me to ask tonight is, what do we say to Arminians today? Should we be taking a bold, fresh stand like those at Dort and opposing their teaching, or are Arminians today what they believe different than Jacob Arminius and the Remonstrants?
Most Arminians today are much worse than Arminius. So we sort of have to bear that in mind as a reality. Arminius would have said something like, he would never have summarized it this baldly, but he would have said something like, we're saved 99% by grace. He might even have said, we're saved 100% by grace, but we can resist that grace. So we don't make the grace by our action, but we can resist the grace by our action. Many Arminians today are much more Pelagianizing than Arminius himself was. So in a sense, the Arminianism we face in many places is more serious, which is not to say that we should be, mean to our Arminian friends or refuse to talk to them, but we should push a little bit on the question, do you really believe we're saved by grace alone? How can you really call yourself a child of the Reformation without being able to articulate how you uphold grace alone?
Now, no doubt there's people that will watch this interview that are an Arminian, and maybe they've never even heard that term before, and they're kind of looking at themselves saying, is that what I believe? Maybe just briefly state, like, what is an Arminian? And then if you were speaking and directing your words to them, what would you encourage them to read, or how would you encourage them to respond as they're beginning to kind of question some of those beliefs?
Well, you could read Saving the Reformation. Actually, starting with R.C.'s book, Chosen by God, would be a great place to encourage people to begin. We do have to recognize, I think, that there are a variety of Arminianisms, that Arminianism doesn't come in just one form. Arminius himself seems to have been motivated not by a desire to assert human free will, but by a desire to protect the goodness of God as he understood it. So most subsequent Arminians have been more focused on human ability and the freedom of the will to some extent. And so you have to figure out a little bit where the Arminians are coming from. Just as a lot of Calvinists have never heard of the Synod of Dort, a lot of Arminians have never heard of Arminius. So labels may not be all that helpful. The great thing always to do, of course, is to look at the Bible together. And if you get them to look into Ephesians 2 or Romans 3 and really press what is it that the Bible is saying human beings can do in response to the grace of God, that's probably the most effective way forward. And then after you convince them, give them a copy of Saving the Reformation.
So when you buy one at the bookstore, get 2 copies, because we all have Arminian friends.
That's right.
Yeah.
Or 3 or 4.
One thing I will say is in the book, Dr. Godfrey has done a new translation of the canons from Dort, and I think just reading through those is worth the price of the book in and of itself. So I do want to kind of dig into some of, you agree with that? Yeah.
Absolutely,
yeah.
And I'm delighted to hear that you read them.
Yeah.
That's a really good thing.
But honestly, it really was an edifying time to go through those canons and to hear in clear modern English what they were stating, and just honoring and exalting God and reminding us of our sinfulness and our need of grace.
I think sometimes people have been put off when they pick up what Dort did and say, read canons, and people don't, what is that? What are canons? Well, it's just the Greek word meaning rules. So these are the rules theologically that the Synod of Dort adopted. And then you look at a lot of the traditional translations are divided into heads of doctrine. So that sounds really heavy. That just means chapters. And so what I tried to do was to translate, the canons were written by the Synod for the church. It was intended for people in the pews to read and be edified by. The great problem is that the international language at the time of the meeting of the Synod was Latin. And so the canons were written in Latin. And Latin is a wonderful language of great clarity if you read Latin. But most of us don't anymore. So the problem with Latin when you translate it is, Latin can be very, very clear with very, very long sentences. And English sentences don't work that well as very, very long sentences. And modern English readers don't do very well with very long English sentences. So basically what I tried to do in this translation was to break up the sentences to make clear how straightforward the teaching is. So it's not simplistic, but it's very straightforward and accessible and useful, I think, is what I'd want to underscore, useful to people in churches.
Yeah, I was surprised in how practical the canons were. Like even Article 17, which I'm sure you know, from
the first head of doctrine.
That's right, on predestination. They speak about Christians having hope for their children that die in infancy. Tell us a little bit about that, but can you expand on why they wanted to write this, as you said, for the people and not for academics?
Well, one of the charges that the Arminians had brought against the Reformed in the Netherlands, and this was part of the Arminian strategy to undermine public confidence in the Reformed, the Arminians said, well, what the Reformed teach is that children dying in infancy are plucked from their mother's breast and, despite baptism and the prayers of the church, are plunged into hell. And this was a huge pastoral problem in a society where maybe in many families, 2/3 to 3/4 of the children would die in infancy. So people are very much left wondering what happens to these children. Is it true that the Reformed doctrine of election means that these children are condemned to hell, or at least we're left completely uncertain as to their fate? And so the canons wanted very clearly to respond to that misrepresentation, and so yes, in the 17th article of the first head of doctrine, it says, "Godly parents may believe without doubt that their children dying in infancy are elect and saved." So they didn't say may be saved, could be saved, might be saved. They were very adamant that these children, as children of godly parents, because they belong to the covenant of grace, and that's not precisely a baptism debate, but it's what 1 Corinthians 7 says, your children are holy. And the position of the Synod is, if holy children die in infancy, they must surely be saved. And I think that's right reasoning.
Now, you have translated it in clear language, understandable language, but in their rejection, the Synod uses very strong language. They say, those who teach this deceive the more simple and clearly contradict the sacred scriptures. This teaching is an invention of human understanding, this pernicious error. They falsely undermine the apostle. That teaching is repugnant. They recall the Pelagian error from hell. So there's very strong language that they use.
You don't know Dutch people, do you? Sorry.
That's okay. How do these canons instruct us today when we're wanting to defend the faith and defend Reformed theology? Is this an example of the language we should be using? Is this not strong enough?
Well, I think what's interesting, and it didn't ever really strike me till I was working on the book, the rejection of errors never mentions the Arminians by name, never mentions the remonstrants by name. What is rejected is errors. And so people are not being condemned here. People who hold certain errors are being criticized here. And so I think what the fathers at Dort would say is, as my mother used to say, if the shoe fits, put it on. That is, if you're guilty of this error, then you better listen to this condemnation. But it's not a blanket condemnation of Arminianism, because by the time of the Synod of Dort, I think Arminianism itself was splitting into various factors, some much more radical than others. So that actually some of the Arminians, shortly after the Synod of Dort, began to move towards Unitarianism. I mean, it was really moving in a very rationalistic direction.
So jumping just to a different subject, they condemn curiosity. What did they mean by curiosity historically at the time they were writing it, and what's kind of a practical application for us in the church today?
Well, in medieval theology, in the medieval church, curiosity was regarded as a soul-destroying error. And what they really meant by curiosity was a speculation about truth and about God that went far beyond revelation. And so it was a sort of, they almost always said vain curiosity, because it was an empty pursuit of questions that God had chosen not to answer. And that's the warning. Let us limit ourselves to biblical revelation, the Synod is saying. Now, this is ironic because the charge against Calvinism, Orthodox Calvinism, has frequently been that Calvinists are sort of rationalists, just following logical deduction, not following the Bible. The fathers at the Synod of Dort would have said the exact opposite is true. Arminianism is a result of rational extension of thought beyond the Bible, and Calvinism is sticking to the Bible, limiting itself to the Bible. And so if you press many Arminians today and said, why do you believe in free will? They can't really say it's in the Bible. The Bible doesn't teach free will anywhere. So why do they believe in free will? Well, because the Bible teaches moral responsibility, and they have decided logically that if you have moral responsibility, you must have free will. Well, that's a logical reasoning. I don't think it's valid, and it's certainly not biblical. So it's the Synod, really, who I think in a fairly simple way stays with the explicit statements of Scripture.
You've mentioned already that there were false accusations made against the reformers and those that believed in Reformed theology, stereotype, straw man kind of argumentation. Mm-hmm. And you note that it is not to say too much to say that if predestination is not a comfort to the people of God, that it has not been rightly understood or taught. Help us understand, how should we think about predestination? What is the non-straw man view of the Calvinists' sovereign God?
Well, there's several ways to approach that. One would be just to sit down and read Ephesians chapter 1. Because the remarkable thing about Ephesians chapter 1 is the way that Paul celebrates predestination as the solution to problems, not the source of problems. Paul's not embarrassed to talk about predestination. He praises God for it because it celebrates God's effective plan to save a people, which he carries out. And Paul thinks this is wonderful. We should all think it's wonderful. And if we don't see that as wonderful, we need to go back to the drawing board because we're not really understanding it. Predestination does not stand over us as a mystery in the mind of God that threatens us. It's the doctrine that assures us that the God who brings us to faith, gives us grace, will preserve us to the end, and he's brought us to faith, he's brought us to grace according to his eternal plan. So from everlasting to everlasting, the glory is God's, the work is God's, and the comfort and encouragement then is ours. Now the canons in the first head of doctrine, which is on predestination, approaches this question also in a slightly different but very helpful way. It begins not in eternity, thinking about the decrees of God, but it begins in history with the human condition. So Article 1 of the first head of doctrine says that we're all dead in trespasses and sins. Well, let that sink in a minute. How can dead people help themselves? Dead people cannot help themselves. So God has to help them. And how does he help them? Well, he sends. It's very interesting what the canons say next. God sends his Son to save them, and then God in his mercy sends preachers to tell them about his Son, and then God sends the Holy Spirit to bring the elect to faith. So starting with the human problem and condition, and then talking about God's gospel preservation, and then answering the question, why do some believe and some don't? You know, that's a good question. Here, we can have a pretty high level of confidence that we're all believers. We didn't go to dinner to miss this session. We're here. So this is, was that bad? Yeah. So here we are, a group of believers. And if I say to you, why do you believe and some do not? There's really only two answers. We may fudge it, but there's really only two answers. Either we believe because we're better than the people who don't. We're wiser, we're smarter, we're more moral, we take the right decision, we're better people. Or we believe because God gave us the gift. We're not better. We're not more moral. We're not more wise. And I think Dort develops that idea really rather brilliantly.
Well, I think that's a wonderful place for us to to end this conversation. Can I encourage you to make sure you pick up a copy and then read it? You can tell Dr. Godfrey that you also have read Saving the Reformation.
Nathan is to be congratulated on careful reading.
Can you show your appreciation for Dr. Godfrey?